Great, thank you so much, and thanks for the invite. And it's nice to see people here. Um, we Normally Jonathan goes first, but today we decided that I would go first, and Jonathan has a more sort of PowerPointy presentation. Jonathan, do you want to say anything before I do a few words?
Over to you, David.
Okay. We were kindly invited to talk about our work as reflected in The World as Abyss, the Caribbean and Critical Thought in the Anthropocene, which is a book that came out last year as open access as a PDF and hard copy as well. And so let's sort of go for that then. It's a follow-up book to a previous book we did on Anthropocene islands and sort of discourses of entanglement and relation. And that book was quite a heuristic book, looking at how people sort of felt there was a crisis of modernist thinking that I'm sure we're pretty much familiar with, and how the figure of the island was enrolled in enabling people to think about systems and relations and ways of becoming and of differentiating rather than homogenizing mainlands. So I'm not going to talk about that book, but you can sort of see it's like a figurative role of the island that even though we were drawing on people thinking about how islands literally help them in their thinking, we were sort of understanding it and presenting it as more of a figurative tool of enablement. So we were thinking about how islands played a role in enabling sort of relational thought in different ways. And I mentioned that just to sort of like put forward our sort of method. So when we're talking about the world as abyss, the Caribbean and critical thought in the Anthropocene, we're really looking at how the Caribbean is drawn on as a resource for critical thinking in our contemporary time, let's call it the Anthropocene, after modernity or in a moment of crisis for modernist thinking. And when we talk about critical thought, we're generally, but not solely, talking about critical Black studies, generally Canada and America, and how they sort of figuratively draw on the Middle Passage, the plantation, sort of the sort of lack of equality despite demands of democracy and progress, and how the Caribbean is seen as like the fulcrum of the construction of the modernist order materially and ideologically. We don't have much time. So that's the sort of the background. And what I'm emphasizing is the figurative nature. That we're not saying that literally the Caribbean is discussed in those ways. It's not a book about the Caribbean. And we're aware that the Caribbean is drawn on to do all sorts of different methodological work. It's just that at the moment, it seems to be drawn on in this particular set of ways. So, and that's what we're looking at. Why are we looking at it like that? We're looking at it because we're interested in, I guess, in our work in our disciplines. John's a human geographer, I do international relations, and we're interested in resources for us to use to engage in sort of the methodological, conceptual discussions in our disciplines, which tend to be all agog with a relational or an ontological turn, the sort of after modernity move to a different, more than human, post-human assemblage way of accessing real reality more effectively, more efficiently, because we're aware that modernist, rationalist, instrumental, linear, reductionist, abstract understandings have led us to sort of environmental destruction that we're witnessing. So our concern is to engage with the critique of modernist rationalism and how it's presented as a relational or alternative. So that's sort of the introduction to the introduction. And where we sort of are is, how does that relational alternative work? Does that relational alternative, I'll talk about briefly, does that achieve what people think it might achieve in making a break? Is it useful? And then we also want to sort of discuss what people call like a non-relational critique of relationism. I don't know the people here in the room and where you're at and what you're thinking about the sort of sentences that I'm sort of trying to formulate. But if I was to schematically put four different ontologies or imaginaries, one might be modernity, I think we're familiar with. Another one might be a post-human relational becoming, which can be traced and sensed and engaged with beyond the limits of a human sort of phenomenology, a modernist epistemology. And then a third one might be a non-relational understanding of the inaccessibility of the world, a humbling of the human against this inability to instrumentalize and reproduce. And then a fourth one might be what we call the abyssal approach. So there's sort of a lot going on there. So let me just be really quick about the relational and the non-relational and the abyssal, and then John can clarify stuff. This is just work that we're working on. So this is the field, the theorizing after modernity, critique after modernity. How do we avoid just reproducing solipsistic understandings of the subject and the world and new ways of governing and subordinating us? It's the sort of thing. So first thing is the relational turn in all the different disciplines, the sort of critique, the break from modernity, how we sort of decenter the subject, how we begin to flatten the world, bring the human back into the world, sort of critical theory approach, material feminist, actor networks, assemblages, relations. We're looking at maybe a key trope for a relational turn is how differences make differences, rather than a universalizing one world. We're looking at how, it may be fine in a violently coerced world or the world of the test tube, but in the real world, differences are important. But rather than assuming that one size fits all, we need to engage with how different societies, different systems, different moments creatively enable new things to emerge, how we're responsive to those, how we're sensitive to those things, and in a relational turn, how we govern through those things, how we overcome those problems and limitations. For many people, sort of, it's preventing climate change from getting worse. There's a futural imaginary there where we ditch like the modernist human, become more than human or post-human, and then we engage in multiple emergencies, which we can sort of work with. Discourses of resilience often come into that sort of imaginary as well, bring us back into a world of unexpected and multiple ways of engagement where things aren't just going to repeat. We can't just extrapolate from a certain set of data. So very, very crudely, I'm sort of saying that might be a relational turn, a relational ontology. It's still about saving and salvaging and subordinating us to a world against a future that we want to sort of avoid. Many people think that's brilliant and amazing, and that's fine, good for them. Then there seems to be a sort of critique of that. In the field of human geography, it's often understood as like negative geographies. I'm not sure that people here are geographers. I'm imagining it could be all sorts of philosophers and politics and everything else. But there's a critique of the relational turns being too creative, too generative, too easily just reproducing the human again, in fact, as a more than human, not just having a modernist epistemology and doing modernist stuff, but also tapping into indigenous, local, alternative cosmologies, engaging differently, multiplying, and doing things. It's too happy clappy on every sort of level, ontologically, temporalities, etc. What they would argue for is the importance of non-relation, our inability to trace and to sense and to engage in these creative processes and assemblages of becoming that we can somehow direct and enable in productive ways. And so for a de-ontologizing or a non-relational, I'm sure people can help me out here, the idea is that we're engaging with the world, with alterity, with otherness as a way of unknowing, as a way of undoing, that we're not like accumulating more things and more multiple ways of being in the world, but all we can actually do is sort of undo what's already been done. And in that undoing, there's a generativity that enables us to be open to the world in different ways, to the unexpected, etc. And that's often the sort of, in relationship to the void, there's a generativity of non-relation. It's a process of undoing, because we realize we don't need to do more things and know in more multiple ways, because every way that we know is going to be destructive and genocidal and ecocidal, and the job is like an undoing, an unworking. So what me and John would argue is that that job of undoing and unworking still creates new hierarchies of being and of governing, because obviously not everyone can unwork themselves in adequate ways. We also understand that a non-relational aspect has a similar sort of ontology to a relational aspect, that, as far as I'm aware, it's difficult to tear apart a relational understanding of the world and engagement and transformation and change, and a non-relational one, because they're two sides of the same coin, because it always has to be an inner process, an inner working that's being undone, that meets in a certain way, that enables a certain openness. So you're still managing and governing and saving the world, blah. So what we're sort of working through is an alternative approach to both non-relation and relation, which we're sort of calling the abyssal. So just in one trope, a non-relational view is like staring into the abyss and the void and nothingness, and through that undoing yourself. I think what we're beginning to articulate in the world as abyss is a figurative imaginary of critique from the abyss. I'm thinking that maybe I've set up a sort of context that John's presentation can speak to. I don't want to speak into John's presentation, and sort of that would be reproducing things. John, is that okay for you to do your?
That's excellent, Dave. Thanks. Which screen am I sharing? I don't know what one I'm on.
We see you at this
Okay.
point.
Hang on. So I want to share that one, I think. Is that showing a slide thing?
Yes.
Excellent.
Thank you.
There we go. All the prelims were. That was really good, David. Thank you very much indeed for that kind of helps draw out a lot of the kind of key terms and key things we're engaging in. And I think what's really important, as David stressed, you know, Anthropocene Islands, the world as abyss, you know, these are just ongoing projects. And so we really value any questions, any way we can, you know, help clarify things for ourselves as much as for you. You know, it's very much work in progress. And I think what we've kind of settled on for the moment as our concern is this move to critique beyond relation. So critique beyond the relational turn. And what would that mean? What does it mean for various people? What do we think it means for us? And so on. And so the world as abyss is in smaller letters here, because it's what we see as part of this kind of ongoing project. As was mentioned, I do have a more formal talk. It might be useful to do this in terms of just reading from a bit of a script. And then, you know, as David's been doing, we're throwing out terms and concepts and things. Obviously, they're there for questions, and we very much hope you engage with that. So I'll just start this kind of more formal thing now. So as David was saying, recent developments in the social sciences and humanities reflect an interest in what we're calling critique beyond relation. The dominance of the relational and ontological turn, including, as David was mentioning, such developments as actor network theory, new materialism, affect theory, posthumanism, pluriversal, indigenous and decolonial approaches, I think it's fair to say it's been really increasingly called into question. Much of this contemporary theoretical work, as David was saying, driven by concerns of the Anthropocene in particular, is now being scrutinized for affirming rather than challenging modernist constructions of an available and instrumentalizable world. So there's this search going on, I think, in a lot of literatures, as David was talking about, for alternative approaches which do not seek to be so generative, as Dixa Ramirez Diola would say, or productivist, as someone like Andrew Culp would say, which do not jump to easy assertions that we can move beyond or be outside or after modernity. And I think this is quite important for us as well. There's a desire to curb some of the more affirmative, and I think it's fair to say, as David was pointing out when he was saying happy clappy, even celebratory aspects of work on relational futures and alternative possibilities. I think reflective of such concerns is this really nice little book that Dicta Ramirez Diola produced called This Will Not Be Generative. And this describes how the relational turn extends rather than challenges colonial modernity's appropriative gaze. So we see here for Ramirez Diola, for relational ontologists have a positive or additive propensity. The more is just as likely to be rhetorical as physical or biological. Now, Donna Haraway is really in critical sight in this book here. So for leading posthumanists such as Donna Haraway, the accusation is that more is also bound with pathos. Caring, she writes, means becoming subject to the unsettling obligation of curiosity, which requires no more at the end of the day than at the beginning. These writings encrust generativity with seemingly positive descriptors, e.g. caring, loving, thick, and so on, disguising the destruction also taking place. So there's this kind of general vibe in the air to kind of critique relational approaches, as it were. So from debates about colonialism and posthumanism to the Western appropriation of the indigenous to save the Western subject from itself in the Anthropocene, to logistical modes of capitalism and contemporary algorithmic governance, the positing of relation and ontology is increasingly understood to enact a violence. In response, there's been a growing critical interest in different approaches, often, as David was saying, framed around such tropes as the non-relational, the non-ontological, or the negative, which seek to push against what is increasingly seen as the appropriative hand of the relational and ontological turn. These alternative approaches are incorporating more of a concern for the breakdowns and suspensions of ontology and relation in the world, with the purpose of affirming and giving us a more realistic or alternative understanding of contemporary world making from the relational turn. Such developments are perhaps particularly influenced by recent developments in Black studies. So one would think here of the work of Stefano Hani and Fred Moten and the Undercommons, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, also their more recent book, All Incomplete. Now, this kind of stands for a swathe of critical developments that have taken place in Black studies, where Blackness, as opposed to the violent colonial rendering of Black being, is often understood as non-ontological, unobtainable, suspending and disrupting force in the world. Now, as David was saying, we really want to stress more generally how, whilst critical Black studies is probably at the forefront of these kind of debates, the turn towards the non-relational, the non-ontological is playing out very widely across a whole range of disciplines and fields. So, for example, as David was saying, in my own field of geography, in edited collections such as David Bissell's Mitch Rose and Paul Harrison's Negative Geographies, and Paul Kingsbury and Anna Secure's A Place More Void, the negative and the void are being conceptually enrolled as non-relational, non-ontological forces in the world which disrupt the relational drive for coherence and appropriation. Now, whilst these approaches understand non-ontology and non-relation hermeneutically, Blackness, the negative, the void, for examples, as in the world, our abyssal approach moves otherwise and does not go beyond a modern, or for that matter, actually a relational ontology, but is rather one that seeks to refuse the lure of the world. Now, we think this is perhaps crucial. Unlike currently dominant approaches to critique beyond relation, the abyssal approach, and I stress we are in the process of still thinking this through, refuses the ongoing legacies of the hermeneutical tradition, the desire to bring new and better or more real worlds into being or cognizance. The abyssal approach stays with the trouble, not in a Haraway kind of way. It stays with the limits of the constitution of the modern human and its world. Indeed, our abyssal approach is being developed from an explicit rejection of the hermeneutical centering of the subject with its abilities to read, see, and to interpret and expand its world. And I think that the non-relational and non-ontological approaches that dominate critique beyond relation are very much still in that hermeneutical way of sensing and attuning aesthetically and expanding the world. We're instead particularly inspired by the para-ontological approach of Nahum Dimitri Chandler. And as I'll discuss, and I'll unpack this in a minute, and the approach desediments the strata of systems of thought, engaging Dubois' double consciousness, understood as enabling for a second sight. It doesn't refute ontology, as in much of the kind of work on Fred Moten kind of way, as in the conic dominant approaches to critique beyond relation, which I've just been discussing. Precisely the opposite. It deconstructs, after Derrida, how such a refutation would leave one with no hold, as Axel Carrera frames it, beyond the system that substantiates it. The point, as Carrera says, is to dislodge a sedimented hierarchy with an inverting double movement that remains incessantly aware that its operations take place within the very system being deconstructed. So I'll clarify this now. To clarify the para-ontological approach, we can turn to Derrida's essay, Force of Law, the Mythical Foundation of Authority. This examines how it is not the status of exclusion or inclusion within the law, of ontology in the world, that is at stake. The stakes are not about advocating for more progressive or inclusive law, or for an understanding of the non-relational or non-ontological as these generative forces in the world, which disrupt and detour the law. Rather, the focus is the necessary but disavowed grounding of the law itself in non-law. So what Derrida is saying really in this quote that's on the overhead, his point is that law and non-law come into being at the same time, but all that appears is law. From within the world of the cut, every subject is caught up in this apartic structure in advance. So from within the world as constituted, it's difficult to challenge the arbitrary violence of the cut. Here, a crucial feature of Nahum Chandler's para-ontology, that it deals with a double bind or contradiction. On the one hand, it's relatively simple to critique the law as both violent and arbitrary, where, as Chandler uses the example of a slave in the Caribbean, they only become human when they hold property, and they can be simply killed if they do not. But on the other hand, simple here poses a significant challenge, which is the whole purpose of Chandler's para-ontology as an inverting double movement. It's more challenging, more illegitimate to criticize this same violence, since it cannot be summoned to appear before the institution of any pre-existing law. For Derrida, the law does not recognize existing law in the moment that it founds another. Now, we read a kind of deconstructive para-ontological double movement through M. Norbees Phillips' Zong. I'm sure many of you have come across this poem. It's been a very powerful poem about slave traders who drowned slaves, appealing to the law to claim the insurance. On the one hand, colonial law is shown to be gratuitous and violent, but on the other, there is nothing beyond the law, its constitution of being and non-being and the world. Philip says Zong is driven by these central questions, and I'm reading from Philip here. What did in fact happen on the Zong? Can we, some 200 years later, ever really know? Should we? These are the questions I confront. Although presented with the complete text of the case, the reader does not ever know it, since the complete story did not exist. It never did. All that remains are the legal texts and documents of those who were themselves intimately connected to and involved in a system that permitted the murder of Africans on board the Zong. Philip says that colonial law substantiates the silence of the slave, but at the same time, the poem, for Philip, is not a recombinant narrative about the resistance of drowned slaves as articulating and articulable subjects. Instead, the poem, as Philip says, is the story that can't ever be told. Thus, for Philip, purposely writing Zong in the colonial language of English, within the boundaries established by the words and their meanings, there are silences. Within each silence is the poem. Using William David Hart's useful analytical breakdown of Chandler's para-ontological approach into 4 components, we can read a double movement working through these components in Zong. First, it is through desedimentation and delimitation of the strata of meaning in colonial law that the racialized cut of ontology is cohered. Philip presses the point, expanding the focus beyond the verbal silence of drowned slaves to colonial law's constitution of silent geographies, as Philip says. Once you're underwater, there is no retrieval. What marks the spot of subaquatic death? Second, through Philip's insistence that this is a story that can never be told, a para-ontological reading of the poem engages hyperthematization, hyperbolization. It is precisely by not putting words into the mouths of the drowned slaves that the poem reinforces, rather than blurs or redeems, the constitutive limits of the human and its world. Third, there is a para-ontological employment of palonym, the use of old names for a new purpose. As noted, only the words of colonial law are recounted in the poem, with stylistically placed gaps and blanks on the pages, reinforcing the silence of the drowned slaves. Finally, there is a move of displacement reinscription, where in registering the silence in these blank spacings, the constitutive limit of the human and the world is reinscribed into the colonial law that displaces it. So we read such an approach, and one of the things that we're struggling to actually read through is examples of this kind of abyssal approach. We're trying to draw these out, but perhaps it might be that this is kind of not attempting to hermeneutically engage the outside of ontology, reading the signs and signals of forces of flux and fugitivity, capable of disrupting attempts at ontological capture. Instead, I think this poem deconstructs, or more accurately, desediments, disturbing the grounds that serve to found narratives of separation and distinction, claims of ontological existence, claims of distinct modes of ontology and non-ontology, locating their emergence through coercive violence. So schematically speaking, borrowing from Axel Carrera to kind of further clarify this analytical distinction we're trying to draw out, whilst the dominant approach to critique beyond relation that engages the non-relational and the non-ontological remains hermeneutical and can be understood as putting ontology radically into question, amounting to an additive or supplementary correction for understanding how contemporary ontological constructions of the world are problematic, para-ontology poses radical questions about ontology, developing an alternative line of critique rather than affirmation. So, as David was saying, in our recent book, The World as Abyss, we engage how the Caribbean has become key for many today who work in this kind of non-ontological and non-relational mode of critique. We draw out how for much contemporary work, there's this focus on the uprooting of colonial violence through the Middle Passage, and how this produced an unrooted, disavowed and dissolved subject. However, I think we want to underscore here the distinctiveness of an abyssal approach compared to these more dominant approaches of critique beyond relation. When the subject, the non-ontological or the non-relational, is read hermeneutically as somehow literally existing in the world, when it is still worlded, then the abyssal approach shows that we are a return to affirmative discourses of the subject and the world. An abyssal approach does not seek to expand the world, but rather stays with the trouble, refusing the ongoing law of the world. There's no generative outside to modernity in an abyssal approach, where the non-relational, I underscore, is here understood as not literally existing and doesn't necessarily have this property that it does in a lot of contemporary debates about critique beyond relation. So as noted, we're inspired more by a para-ontological approach of Nahum Dimitri Chandler and his readings of Du Bois, which deconstructs how the veil of modern world-making leaves us with no hold beyond the limits of the constitution of the modern subject and its world. So just to finish off now here, we underscore that the move to taking critique beyond relation is increasingly prevalent. We focused upon debates in critical Black studies, I guess, mainly, but I really want to underscore it's taking place elsewhere as well. In this dominant way of currently taking critique beyond relation, there's a subtraction from the coherences of affirmation and ontology and relation, and an adding in of an aesthetic awareness of non-relation and the non-ontological. Thus, for example, Mitch Rose, who works in geography, uses the concept of the void to push material semiotics, the hermeneutics of signs, further by examining how bodies not only interpret what they sense, but also what they do not sense. In doing so, like actually a great deal of many others today, he seeks an aesthetic attunement not only to relation, but also to the absence of relation. By contrast, we're trying to push an abyssal project of one of critique, not affirmation. It's enabling for perhaps what could be called a metapolitical critique of contemporary thought, exposing how the modern subject continues to expand itself in new ways, extending the limits of thinkability to make present and actually bring more into the world, to salvage rather than end the generative purchase of the modern subject and its world. So the development of our abyssal approach leads us to think that these are perhaps the crucial questions going forward. Questions of hermeneutics versus power ontology, questions of addition versus what Denise Ferreira da Silva would call negativation, questions of affirmation versus refusal. And these are the kind of questions we're trying to think through, and we look forward to discussing with you around this debate around critique beyond relation. So I don't know if David's got, that's kind of the more formal bit. How do I stop sharing? If I stop sharing?
Yeah,
Yes, you've stopped.
Excellent.
I think that's enough from
Yeah.
us.
So if anyone has any questions that they'd like to raise now, the floor is open. I really am not familiar with the discipline of geography, so this is very interesting to me. And immediately what it brings to my mind is this distinction in information and data science between relational database management, which has been the standard since the 70s, and then since 2009 there's been a non-relational database, like it's called NoSQL, which is like a not a structured query language. So I don't know what an abyssal SQL would be, but I guess I also was my other immediate impression was how much poetry is discussed in the book, and I'm reminded of Alexis Pauline Gumbs' M Archive book where there is a line, something like it, and then the landfill actually became an ontology, the ontology. So I wanted to ask what the analytic lens of like eco poetry or geopoetry or nature poetry, which might enlarge concepts from poetry, and imagine the excesses of colonialism as extraction in the writing itself. Yeah, how do you see the study of poetics in relation to an abyssal geography, if you might call it that?
Yeah. Do you want to go, David, or shall I?
I was wondering if you wanted to collect a few
Yeah.
questions or comments, or if
Yeah.
you sometimes Q&A can be a little bit, but I mean, it's up to you guys.
Yeah, there's also a comment in the chat that I can add from Hamid. How does abyssal thought philosophically critique the ontological assumptions underpinning conventional understandings of being and existence? Would
So,
anyone else like to raise any other questions?
yeah, I feel,
Yeah.
John, did you want to go?
Well, we've got three. I don't know how many I can hold in my head.
Where's the third?
We have two just then from
Okay.
Mo, and then in the chat. So one on technology and then
Yeah, I got you.
point and
Yeah, I
guns.
suppose I asked too. Okay.
So I mean, maybe we could talk about Alexander Galloway. I don't know if that connects to what you do. Galloway's work.
Sure. Yeah. I see that.
So in saying that, I don't know is the answer. I mean, I think I was like, there's a kind of, so there's his work on Laurel that kind of connects to some of this stuff, I guess. There's the work on, I guess, not being seen and know, which kind of connects to Galloway's stuff. Perhaps one way in which we've been trying to think through some of the stuff is Galloway wrote a really nice chapter in a book with Mackenzie Walk and who's the other guy? Was it Thacker? It was really nice the way he drew out Hermes and hermeneutics. And so perhaps one way in which we would we've kind of find that quite interesting is the way in which that plays into the hermeneutical tradition through constant becoming and relation as an extension of the project of modernity. I don't know if David wants to comment on that, but I could come back on the Pauline Gumbs question.
So I'm sort of worrying about like the focus for our discussion. I'm sensing that people are coming from a lot of different directions. How does it relate to conceptual models, conceptual history of languages, given they reject the human hermeneutical model? So what I'm thinking is that the key thing is about what we're sort of arguing in the Abyssal project is about a rejection of the lure of the world and the lure of the subject. What we want to sort of argue is that post-human understandings of the subject and even sort of non-relational understandings of the subject still reproduce genres of the subjects in the world. And the mere fact that they're doing that, they're reproducing hierarchies of being. So I think this relates to some of the questions as well about how the abyssal relates to conventional ontological understandings of being and existence, and the issue around the hermeneutics. And so for us, we're sort of faced with a range of choices of subject-world relations and how they're constructed in different ways. Maybe one way of collectively engaging with what we're trying to do is to think of it as sort of like a post-Sylvia Wynter framing. Sylvia Wynter sets up framework in which the subject-world relations are reconstituted, different constructions of man or subject, and thereby different constructions of the world or the capacities and the abilities that are needed, and different constructions of how we govern on the basis of enabling those capacities. So that the abyssal approach is trying to sort of break from different attempts to reconstruct subject-world relations. And it's difficult because we're all different disciplines and all the rest of it. Let's assume that a relational ontology, the more than human sort of assemblaging of many different perspectives and ontologies and cosmologies, sort of creates like a super subject. And it is even more sensitive and more aware of the multiplicities of differentiation. And what we're sort of seeing is that that way enables like another futurity to happen, another set of hierarchies. Some people might understand that or think that there's a connection between a relational approach and a sort of a neoliberal or an institutionalist one that on the basis of there being no universality still enables mechanisms of governing on the basis of difference. To take that argument further in the reduction of the human and the pluralization of the world to the world being opaque, in terms of like a phenomenological view of the subject, that there is still a subject. The subject has to recognize that non-relation, the continual work of undoing, is the only way to be a subject in the world that needs to recognize opacity, because once we refuse opacity in the work of undoing, we're going to make assumptions about continuity, etc. But all of these sort of mechanisms don't actually make a break, is sort of what we're arguing. And we're trying to set up this sort of imaginary, the figurative abyssal subject as not reproducing that question. And how do we do that? We imagine a sort of figurative positionality that is not in the world, that does not make claims, that does not make demands, that doesn't have an identity. Because it's only in the way of doing that that you can then potentially work not on the project of rebuilding or unearthing a reality that's underneath that, not a project of working and unpeeling the onion layers off the subject in order to be able to be properly or in the world in some other desired imaginary way. That's the sort of project that in a sort of basic nuts and bolts way that we're trying to sort of put across. Now, in doing that, there's clear connections with the sort of ontological turn in critical Black studies, which is also sort of imagining what it's like to be liminally in the world and not in the world. That's a very difficult, different imaginary from an identity imaginary of a sort of a liberal subject, which on the basis of its oppression, its exploitation, its identity, its struggle in different ways, then is like the kernel of a new world emerging. So those are the sort of things that we're highlighting in the book mediated through a discussion around the ontological turn in critical Black studies, mainly in North America, and they're drawing on the Caribbean as a source of inspiration, a figurative sort of set of imaginaries that enables that sort of positionality in a response to the failures of the civil rights movement, the limitations of Black Lives Matter, etc. So I'm not sure if that's helpful.
Extend, but I think we've got other questions that we should be addressing now.
Sure, I can. There's a question from Daniel I can read aloud, and then Carl has a question. The question from Daniel I can read is, how does the abyssal approach relate to intellectual history models such as conceptual history or the history of political languages, given that it rejects a hermeneutical model?
So maybe I can take this one. We were just talking about hermeneutics, and we were actually talking about Alexander Galloway. I can't remember exactly what he says about Hermes, but Hermes is the kind of inspiration for the hermeneutical tradition. This is just hopefully another way of saying what David said, but that's okay. So if you think about Hermes, Hermes was the god of movement, the god of exchange, and the inventor of signification and writing. So that feeds into the hermeneutic tradition. So when you get someone who perhaps does the post-human environmental humanities that you were talking about earlier, Marv, we could take someone like Donna Haraway as an example of that. All relation is politics, and all signification is political in that constant relational movement. So what we're interested in is the growing critique of that, as I was mentioning at the beginning of my talk, and the abyssal approach kind of goes counter to that, but perhaps it also sees the hermeneutical tradition playing out in a lot of other work that's taking critique beyond relation. So if you were to think about the way in which Blackness is aesthetically employed to disrupt the grasping hand of ontology, Blackness is still, whilst it's not ontologically available, it's still necessarily a force in the world that can be aesthetically attuned to. So in a sense, it's still there for us. Now, an abyssal approach would obviously think differently to that. So I think that's a really good question, actually, about how it rejects the hermeneutical model, because I think David does as well. I find it quite useful to think it in distinction to hermeneutics as a powerful tradition.
Maybe we'll take Carl's question. I
Yeah,
can
Carl, you can unmute.
Thanks. And thanks for the talk also, John and David. So it's always interesting when kind of discourses meet and clash and sort of trying to communicate over different disciplines. So I'm going to, I'm not even sure if I'm going to help or not, but I think one term that's been coming up a lot and which appears in your book on the Anthropocene Islands and almost on every page in the Abyss book too is kind of the figurative, right? And I think this is another way of kind of getting to what you've been talking about in some way. But I wonder if you can just elaborate a little bit on what you mean by the figurative and what this approach and this kind of analysis does. For instance, it seems to me that there's almost like a secret theory of how different theoretical figures, how different theoretical figures operate on the world. So that you're talking about the modern subject, but you're talking about the non-relational and the relational, but you're talking about it as though these are kind of meta-level figures of subjectivity that one can choose to inhabit. I might be getting this wrong, but I wonder if sort of you can just elaborate a little bit on what you mean by figurative in this approach and what distinguishes it from other things.
Thanks, Carl. Do you want me to come back on anything? So there's some interesting questions on the figurative and paleontology and aesthetics that I'm not sure that we are properly engaged with. So I'm thinking that as long as I was sort of saying about the subject and the world and the sort of the post-human, how does the post-human subject engage in the world? How does the post-human subject still recreate hierarchies of being and knowing and engaging? And I'm thinking that aesthetics is the key mode of sort of postmodern knowledge of the postmodern, the post-human subject being in the world, because you can't apply theories or universal frameworks of understanding. You have to be open. You have to be seeing beyond the appearances. We were talking about sort of media theory, and maybe we could understand the world as a non-ontological world of black boxes, as we were sort of saying. But how things appear doesn't tell you anything. If you're doing international relations like I do, you're doing development, or maybe all the villages look the same. It doesn't mean that how they respond to flooding, to conflict, or whatever, you can't see from the appearances. You have to have a mode of engaging that goes beyond a sort of phenomenological way of generally seeing and judging and thinking. You have to somehow access those internal relations, which are key to responses to external relations and differentiation. So aesthetics and poetics can be the only way in which you begin to retool and enable people to be sensitized to things that you wouldn't be expecting or imagining, or maybe not even seeing in a sort of a traditional framework. And so in that world where you're continually thinking about going beyond what's immediately accessible, in the sort of the marriage of relation and non-relation, where the world is always confronting you as unknowable, as unsettling, as undoing, and at the same time, you're like enabling and developing and realizing yourself in the world still, that those things are sort of key. And I think there's a lot of figurative stuff where, you know, we imagine different futures. Figurative methods are also ways of going beyond and into the world and being more than human. So that's true. That's slightly different from what me and John were suggesting in terms of the figurative subject as not being in the world, not involved in that process of finding the real or real, not being involved in the process of unwrapping the human. And it's figuration is not meant to be an enabling thing in the world. It's meant to be a position that enables us to take a step back. If we're thinking about Frank Wilderson's sort of black pessimism, it's a sort of like a meta position where all paleontology is doing, as far as I'm concerned, is taking a view that is problematizing other attempts to bring back the human and the world, to draw out from them that the problems cannot be resolved at the level of thinking politics differently, at the level of constructing a different human, a different hierarchy, a different real or real. And in terms of the question around our ontology, yeah, it's true that in the ontological tone, in critical Black studies, there's been a lot of discussion around the use of the term, its sort of reactionary roots. Axel Carrera and other people's disagreement with Fred Moten's understanding of paraontology in terms of Blackness as a sort of generative void versus the blackened subject. So I think people use paraontology differently. For me, I think it's, I can't speak for John, for me it's important to clarify the difference between paraontology and deconstruction. To my mind, deconstruction is often working on political binaries which are deconstructed, but the world is still existing behind that. When I'm reading Dimitri Chandler, the paraontological thing is like a way into problematizing constructions of ontology. It's not purely a problematization of the liberal subjects or one particular genre of the human. But I'm sure, I think it's an open question. I'm not trying to define paraontology, just saying how I think that we're using. I think that's enough talking from me.
Let me also read Devin's question in the chat, if I may. It's in terms of paraontology, there are different interpretations of the paraontological project, especially in relation to its problematic origins. Do you interact with paraontology in terms of ahistoricity? In what ways do you build on Carrera and Chandler's work on paraontology? That seemed relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just extend what David was kind of getting into there as well. I mean, I think we found Axel Carrera's piece on paraontology really interesting and extremely useful, and obviously I was drawing upon that in the kind of more formal part of our presentation. I think it's useful because it enables us now. We're not getting into these debates at the level of sophistication that I think Carrera draws out, which is a really powerful paper. But it's allowed us to think through the question of perhaps a non-relational or a non-ontological mode of critique, maybe more in Fred Moten's vein. I'm not sure about R.A. Judy. It's tricky because R.A. Judy is also critiqued in that paper. Where the world is still available. The aesthetic mode is absolutely key in that regard. And this kind of as David was talking out, the sense that there is no literal subject beyond the violence of the construction of the subject, and that's kind of enables an abyssal approach. But for us, perhaps the most useful thing to stress is, as we've developed it more, probably since more clearly in our minds since the book, the abyssal approach is a mode of critique rather than affirmation. And we're really concerned with the way in which the subject keeps getting redeemed and rescued and salvaged in ever more sophisticated, as it were, ways. And so the abyssal approach is one of critique that explores how the limits of thinkability or aesthetics keep getting expanded. So that's perhaps where we're coming from in that regard. I don't know about David, but I've also found David Marriott's work extremely thought-provoking. His recent book, Le Can Noir, I found really useful because, conceptually speaking, for me, it really illustrates the violence that gets done with these additive dimensions that get placed onto the non-ontological. Now, I don't think Marriott phrases it quite like that, but for me, it enabled me to draw that out, perhaps as has Lee Edelman's work on bad education as well. So, yeah, so I think, anyway, we've got more questions, so I'm going to shut up.
I'll read this question from Daniel. Other than the rejection of Eurocentrism present in Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, what distinguishes the abyssal approach from negative dialectics? And then that's something that you discuss on page 53 of The World as Abyss.
So let's take Antoine as well then.
Go ahead and unmute yourself, Antoine, and ask your question.
Hi, thank you very much. I wasn't aware of your work on the abyss. I'm a painter. I've been attracted to the subject for a long time, and so I'm very glad to be able to see that it's fleshed out in some way. On a personal matter, our idea with the abyss is is to presume the subject as you say, as a void, but as a void that has inner dynamics. So maybe there's a one facet to my question would be, how would you describe, let's say, like physics or even like movement dynamics within the abyss? And later on, how would you, let's say, pitch an idea for an artwork that act as a push and pull portal tunnels in the world, so to convey the circulation between this kind of postulation of the abyss?
Yeah, good question. I think that key for us is that the abyss is not outside of modernity. And so just like ontology or any concept or term, everyone uses it in a different way. But we have to like press on and do what we do and try and, with integrity explain what we're talking about. So we sort of called up the world as abyss to try and make a point about, I think, anti-blackness and disavowal. I'm not sure that came across so much in our presentation, or I think it does in the book. But that we live in the world of modernity, and there's no outside of modernity. All we have is Western imaginations of being after modernity or being able to access an outside of modernity. Every relational ontology has an outside. It's obviously necessary. Every non-relational ontology also has an outside. The outside does all the work. John was intimating, all the salvaging and reclaiming work. And I sort of think that this continual reproduction, I think we would say this is like all premised on anti-blackness. Anti-blackness is the sort of disavowed ground that enables the being to be arrayed within a hierarchy on the basis of a world. And to us, that is like an abyssal world. That is a world that can only be imagined and sutured on the basis of the terribleness that we sort of witness. Now, we're not the first people, and the question about Adorno and negative dialectics, I think, is relevant. We're not the first people to sort of say the world is a terrible and degraded and disastrous world. However, I think there was problems with previous attempts to do that because they still had a reality outside of that world, which they felt that there was a temporal difficulty of accessing because of fascism, because of the failure of democratic projects. God knows the failure of Napoleon. Every sort of time has its own nihilist or darker ways of thinking. But to our mind, they did not really get to the depths of it. They were always imagining this outside that was enabling and generative. And that outside always ended up reproducing subjects and worlds. So for us, there's not even another world isn't possible. Another world isn't imaginable. That these things are just ways of subordinating us to this world and what exists. That's the sort of thing that we're trying to sort of draw on in a mediated way. As I said, the book is like, we're not like philosophers. We're looking at how ideas that we're sort of attracted to are being worked through within a particular discipline, within a particular set of discussions around ontology. We're not like doing critical black studies, but we sort of think that sort of discussion, those debates, sort of say something beyond the disciplinary framework, because within our sort of own conceptual and theoretical traditions, it's been much more difficult to, I don't know, see the wood for the trees, to sort of get rid of a lot of the stuff that needs to be got rid of in order to think about, how we might make a stand of refusal, or however we might want to see it. We don't really think we don't have a political program or even a proper meta-political program, and we don't have necessarily a proper language to do things. But like, hey ho, you just have to do what you do. And at the moment, we're sort of very much thinking that sort of the meta-political, meta-theoretical framing that emerges through critical black studies and those discussions is something that is really important to think with. For our work, we're doing different things, different disciplines, that sort of stuff. So we're not claiming any great whatever. That's why we present it as sort of a heuristic framing, a work in progress, that sort of stuff. And we're hoping maybe people in the audience who haven't sort of said or written anything in the questions, might, help us out or, have a go at us, whatever. Thanks, Antoine.
Yeah, thanks, Antoine. Can I just come back on that in terms of you were talking about artworks or things like that? I mean, it's, I don't know whether, obviously we've drawn upon, Alexis Pauling Gums was mentioned, and I was talking about Zong and things like that. Obviously we've drawn upon or engaged these various, I guess, artists, but we may not have read them in a way that, I don't know, they'd be necessarily happy with or faithful to, but we're trying to draw out certain aspects of thought that enable us to kind of look at these debates. I mean, for me, I think Zong gets pretty close to it. For me, I think the silence of the spaces and things, I think you can read that in a para-ontological way, but again in the way we're kind of just playing with that and using that. But it is tricky precisely because of what David was just saying. How is it that you draw upon examples that foreground this, films or artworks, or even make artworks, because it becomes, the aesthetic purchase becomes just there, doesn't it? As you were just describing with the void. So it's extremely difficult to not engage in some sort of affirmative work, grounding these debates, as it were, illustrating them. Nevertheless, that's what we want to try and do and explore and see where it goes, as David was saying. We've got quite a few more questions now.
Yeah, from Daniel, this rejection of an outside distinguishes this proposal from other decolonial formulations, such as Enrique Dussel's communitary consensus situated on the exteriority of the system that negates that community. I don't know, Daniel, if you'd like to expand on that, maybe that would be good too. But I'll also read Hamid's question. How does the concept of quantum skin in Gum's work, as interpreted through the lens of abyssal thought, challenge traditional ontological... This is an unusual pairing of questions. Challenge traditional ontological assumptions about separability, determinacy, and sequentiality. In what ways does this notion contribute to a rethinking of the relationship between humans and more than human entities, particularly in the context of modernity's fixed grids of space and time?
Good stuff. I'm happy to go with the first one on the dispossession question. Yeah, exactly. That dispossession does. Unless Daniel wants to come. Daniel, did you want to say more about your question? Yeah, no.
Yeah,
I worked. Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. My difficulties with the colonial approach was, for instance, I worked with Dussel for 2 years, and I couldn't even cite, for instance, John Dewey and John Dewey's works in rural Mexican schools, because there was always an insistence of situating outside of totality, and that actually difficulted broader discussions of this totalization of modernity, where there is not really that outside, or that is problematic. So I'm trying to grasp the specificity or what's different in this proposal from earlier proposals that I have worked with.
Have you come across Maldonado Torres's work on war and the coloniality of being? Daniel, he does a wonderful engagement with Dussel against Levinas, because Dussel is using Levinas and the other, and Maldonado Torres sort of explains how he misreads Levinas and turns Levinas from a figurative other into a literal other. the problem with sort of literalizing other identities is that you begin to affirm relations of repression and coloniality and make out that they provide the resources on which alternative worlds can be built. To my mind, it's a bit similar to a Marxist framework, where Marx is never sort of saying that the working class is an identity, you know, we should be celebrating what workers are doing. Marx's point is that the only thing that the working class can do is like end the world. That it's not like identity politics. It's purely sort of figurative force for destruction. And so I found Maldonado Torres's engagement with Dussels really useful. Just saying, I think the book, the conceptual framework is about the coloniality of being, but I think the book is on war. I mean, other people probably looked at it more recently. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Do you want me to come back on, because we've had a couple of questions on Gums' stuff, so I'll come back on that. I mean, I think what we were trying to do, I was just trying to remind myself what we said, what we did. I think what we're trying to do is, maybe Gums is the figure that's been really adopted in kind of post-humanist environmental humanities kind of work, and, you know, the more than human, learning from dolphins and whales and things like that, in a kind of relational ontology where the skin of the dolphin is available to us. So it affirms a kind of post-humanist way of thinking. And we wanted to kind of read against that in a kind of more abyssal approach, where the quantum skin may not be understood in a kind of Viridian kind of way, but rather in a kind of, as we're saying, as a kind of, in a kind of more para-ontological way, so the irreducibility of it. But, you know, I think as time's gone on, it's fair to say, I don't know what we'd be writing now about this. I think our challenge was very much just to try and look at how these kinds of artists, as we were just discussing a minute ago, are kind of taken up, you know, concepts of the void, concepts of the quantum skin and so on, and kind of, as I say, to supplement a kind of post-humanist environmental humanities thing. So I think our approach was just to critique that angle of debate and say that there'd be other ways of reading this as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think pulling Alexis Gums' work is fundamentally important for our contemporary moment and our contemporary sensitivities. And I mean, I would read it more as a non-relational theorist, that the quantum skin is like a barrier, that it's the recognition of like the immensity, the amazingness and the inaccessibleness of like other entities, which you can't access. You can't do non-relational work if you know, if you're stuck in the subject of the human. I mean, we already rehearsed it with the relational work. You can't do relational work either, but you have to take a further step. Often people think like indigenous or local or grounded or traditional habitual understandings. They do some of that work at breaking from modernity, but they're still also too grounded. They're also too stuck, too racialized, as you might sort of say, too sort of prejudiced, too closed in. And it's only the subject without ontological security that has sort of other capacities, sort of the non-relational, relational things. I think that Alexis Gums' work is so appealing, so powerful to us in our contemporary sort of quest for sort of unmaking the human.
So we've got a question here from Devin about silence. Maybe I can pick up on that.
Yeah, may I read it?
Please do.
I think the point, just for the recording, I think the point about silence you build from Philip's work is very interesting, The totalizing projects of coloniality in some respects demands a response, but how much is there a distinction between an assumed silence and the violence of non-relational projects? In other words, the distinction between silence and an assumed silence is important. How do you distinguish between the two, and do you believe it is possible to distinguish between the two? Additionally, how do you interact with arguments that it is sometimes necessary to speak for the silenced voices?
Yeah, I can come on that, and then David maybe. So obviously what maybe is the figurative nature of what we're talking about here. So we wouldn't be talking about, I don't think we'd be interested in speaking for silent voices in a literal sense, in a kind of participatory development kind of way. I don't think that's something that our project would be wanting to engage, taking that last point first. But the silence, in a sense, is so what our particular reading of Zong was engaging in. Other people will read Zong differently. It might be like Catherine McKittrick might, for example, choose to read it differently, which is all fine. We're just reading it in the way we're kind of doing. In a sense, silence is, there's no hold beyond the modern subject. And so it points to the limits, the constitutive limits of the human and the world. And so I think it's quite interesting that in Zong, there is no attempt to make the drowned slaves articulable subjects. Yeah, it's precisely the opposite. It's inscribing the silence or the limits of the constitutive of the human and the world within the poem. Now, you could argue still that there they are, and even though the silence is silence, it's still there and it's still doing work. But I think it can also be read in a kind of more, as we're reading it, in a more para-ontological way, where it enables us to draw out the constitutive limits of the human and the world. As we were talking about, how do you do this when it comes to poetry and art without aestheticizing something and making it available? David, you might have a different take, I don't know.
So I'm not sure I need to think about that. I think silencing thing works in so many different registers in so many different ways that so I'm not sure. And the point you make about is it possible to distinguish? I think that's like a good sort of point. It depends, what we're doing. It's not possible to speak for the silenced or something like that. So, and then there's also questions about, what does it mean to be silenced and infinitude. So, yeah, I'm not sure where to go on the silence stuff, and we could inverse it and talk about the listening side of things as well. What it means to listen is already enough work in thinking conceptually, let alone speaking in relation to silencing. So no, I have nothing to offer there, I don't think. Unless you want to rephrase the question, Devin, tell me more. Tell us more. Maybe what you're thinking around behind silencing, possibly, if you wanted to.
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I'm also like, I guess, developing or like trying to figure it out. But yeah, I think there's definitely been a lot of work already, like in terms of the positivist approaches or sort of like generative approaches, like you mentioned. So I think taking an abyssal approach is useful in that regard, to sort of think outside the normal boundaries.
Okay, thanks. Are we running out of questions? It could be contributions, doesn't have to be a question as far as I'm concerned. Is
Can
Antoine?
I ask a question, and then Antoine, or Antoine, you can go first if you prefer. Okay, I was going to ask about the abyssal theory of double consciousness. If you could speak a little bit about that. It made me think of Adolph Reed Jr.'s book on Du Bois. It's got the critique of a lot of different theories of double consciousness. And in World as Abyss, you're also critiquing the interpretation of double consciousness as about multiple perspectives or additive. But I think what Reed was trying to do is situate double consciousness in a specific historical context about conversations about the biological theories of racialization, two-ness as an inherited acquired characteristics. And so I was wondering if if you could speak a little bit about the abyssal theory of double consciousness and how it might relate to genetics and biological theories. And Antoine, if you may unmute yourself.
Well, do you want to answer that question first?
Let's take yours as well.
Okay, so well, I'll put on my naive hat because I'm an artist, so I got this this chance to do it. Does this framework or anti-framework you're building works in a negantropic manner? Is it only like putting crude, real blank spot of undoing in the map? And so is it I got the exact naive question. Let's say I'm an artist, or I am an artist. Can I work with that or not? Or is the principle of it is that I succeed in not working in it? Is that yes, that's the question. You see. Thank you.
Your place first, David.
So I'm not sure that the world as the abyssal framework is negantropic. It's against negantropy. And so negantropic work is about sort of differentiating, building, being creative, fighting the sort of inevitable dissipation of order and life. And the human is based on its negantropic struggle through culture, technology, etc. So the struggle for negantropy is the problem as far as the abyssal approach is. And so the abyssal approach as a meta-theoretical or meta-political approach is drawing out what's at stake in negantropy, what's at stake in transforming ourselves in order to remake the world or to salvage the world, what's at stake in terms of like the disavowed aspects of that. It's a bit like, Claire Colbert's Who Would You Kill to Save the World? That's all pretty straightforward, maybe in a more modernist set of constructions that, who bears the costs of whatever these things are, because the world that we're saving is the world of consumption and production of modernity. But equally, what's reproduced when we're doing negantropic work in all sorts of post-human or non-relational ways, there's a lot of non-relational work. It doesn't just have to be the negative geographies. New materialism, speculative realism, they all make no sort of ontological claims. They're all about sort of unmaking the sort of phenomenological human subject that's so problematic and so destructive. So all of those modes of being, all of those aesthetics and poetics are negantropic, and but the problematic aspect of that is they're all just reconstituting modes of being, which then enable us to reproduce negantropic modes when we do, say I do IR, international intervention, democracy, peace, whatever it is that you're doing it. It's you guys, you're still like limited. You guys haven't sort of unmade yourselves. You're still being a bit racialist, a bit parochial, a bit habitual, whatever it is, because you know, us Westerners, we've like already worked out that the problem is like the human subject. And so then that we preach unmaking in our neo-colonial practices. And unfortunately, because the world is a world of hierarchy and a world of power and a world of inequalities and a world of sort of badness, you can't unmake it like that. So that's why it's like a meta-political project, because politics is all about remaking the human of the world. Critique, I'm not sure that I agree with John about the critique affirmation binary. Critique is all about that. It's the same as relation, non-relation. No, 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 no. We're still working through what the logic of the world as an abyss, of an abyssal approach. I think the book does it quite well. And me and John are like, we know it's, you know, it's a sort of at the beginning of the project. I think the book does it quite well, but I still think there's work to go because we are so steeped in critique and unmaking and undoing and humility. It's quite difficult sometimes for us to realize those are exactly the tropes through which we're governed. You know, because we're so tied up with being radical and critical at the end of that Enlightenment tradition. But that whole tradition is the problem, and how we break through that. That's not straightforward. And every time I read my own attempts to do it, I realize that I haven't done it. But you know, it's okay. Life goes on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. I mean, in many ways, the book, you know, obviously we're quite happy with it, and it was, you know, written a little while ago, but it's precisely that. You know, every time you try, and because you were asking for like artistic approaches to this and things like that, you know, that was your specific question. Every time you try and do that, it then becomes re-enrolled within it. I mean, perhaps a really good way of thinking about it is, if I, you know, I'm sure many people are aware of the undercommons. The undercommons for me is a brilliant diagnosis of logistics. Yeah, but it's a description of how the world takes place, as it were, the forces in the world. So it goes to show just how much critique ends up, you know, describing what's actually already going on. But this can sound a bit it can maybe take the debate slightly in a dead end direction. I think the aspiration is still there in the abyssal approach to try and use that as a kind of meta-political form of critique. And that's what we're trying to just think through at the moment, the way in which the subject, in so many debates that you think, for example, with the non-relational or the void or the negative or the non-ontological, move in a certain direction, but then the subject is still there, sensing and affirming and aesthetically attuning to the world, which is actually, for me, a really nice definition of logistics, of how it actually just plays out. It's a nice description. Perhaps we could think of it as an updating of how the world takes place, the turn to the non-relational and the non-ontological, a useful updating clarification, rather than necessarily a mode of critique as such as we would perhaps want to be trying to think through, if that answers your question in a different way. But David may disagree. We can get going on that.
So what about people who haven't really said very much?
There's another question here from Carolyn. It says, "Hi David, hi Jonathan. In how far is your claim that the world is inescapably bad and violent an argument on an ontological level?"
Want me to speak, David? Yeah. So, I mean, I think for us, it's still within the world of modernity. So perhaps what does distinguish our approach and why we're perhaps drawn to the para-ontological approach is it's still very much within a modern ontology. It's not about the shift towards the celebration of relational generativity, or the shift towards the celebration of the non-ontological and aesthetic attuning to the negative, those kinds of things. It is we don't think that the modern world has ended, that there isn't an outside to it, and there isn't a beyond it, there isn't an after it. We're still thinking that the stakes of critique can come back and focus on the modern subject and the modern world, and how it keeps on extending its kind of limits of thinkability, its ability to expand itself in ever new and interesting ways. So for us, I think it's still very much grounded within the world of modernity. Clearly, for the kind of authors we engage in the world as abyss, they're tracking that through the Middle Passage, the grounding of modernity on the violence of colonialism, the production of ontology through that as well. So I think it kind of intersects with those debates. I don't know if David wants to chip in.
Question. Is it an ontological argument? I mean, or is the abyss, what do we mean by ontology? And does ontology presuppose like the ontic and those sort of binaries? And so I think that the world is inescapably bad and violent is like more than ontology. It's fun, yeah. I mean, it's pre-ontological because it's like it's the badness and violentness of the world that is so baked in that is the precondition, the enabling condition for ontologies. Would be my view. I haven't really thought about it, but it's always good to question the terms of the question.
Just to clarify there, though, when we say pre-ontological, it's baked in, but I don't think we think of it as pre-ontological in the same way as a kind of force, a mystic force in the world that often gets involved with a trope. So I just wanted, for me anyway, that would be a bit strange, but maybe David wants to.
Well, there's a lot of us here in the room virtually. I mean, ontologies, they don't come from nowhere. They're not like sort of natural or something. So, I think that there must be something more, because it's not, our problem is the abyssal framework is a critique of all ontologies, even an ontology that says there's no ontology, even a non-relational, de-ontologizing understanding of that everything is a black box and entirely inaccessible. That's an ontology, and so that's sort of what I mean. That like even the ability to talk about ontology, even the ability to make a cut that enables ontology to be a thing, that's already the problem. That's my understanding of the world of the abyss. That's the whole point of figurative separation from the world. But help me out. Don't let John be right.
Also, if I may say, David, there's a little bit of an echo on your voice, and I don't see anyone as being unmuted. So if there's anything that you've recently changed in your settings, and is there someone jumping in right now?
Can you hear me? It's Jack.
Do you have a question? Yes.
I was just going to say, I mean, move on from a non-ontological situation would be building new languages, building new social structures, or deconstructing current languages, deconstructing new social structures into something. Well, I mean, you could be leaning into primitivism. I mean, just ideas really just about moving on from David. Don't say non-ontological. Thoughts?
Thank you. There's also a couple of comments. I'll read one from Daniel. Walter Benjamin's Towards a Critique of Violence also argues that the foundation of law itself is inherently violent, for the disobedience of law faces the promise of violence. Also, Carolyn thinks, so does thinking in terms of ontology require a modernist mode of thought in the first place.
There's quite a few questions there, so we've had three, I think, haven't we? I think
Yeah.
I heard Jared enough. It was a bit tricky, that connection, but I don't think we're kind of engaging in debates of what would happen beyond where we're currently at. You know, I don't think we're speculating upon an imaginary of what could come after. What we're interested in is kind of just critiquing and engaging the ways in which things are already kind of playing out there. So with regards to David might be more qualified to talk on Walter Benjamin than myself, but just to clarify perhaps the way in which we were kind of drawing on Derrida and para-ontology and things like that. I think it was important what David said. We like to sometimes joke, but I think it was important what David said. And with regards to para-ontology isn't actually, for me, and I think David would affirm this, it's not just straight Derrida or deconstruction. So the violence that we were talking about, which I find quite useful to think through in the para-ontological method, the kind of double movement, is the sense that on the one hand, the law is there and it's violent and arbitrary, but on the other hand, what would be beyond, and maybe this comes back to this last question, what would be beyond the violence of the law? There's law and non-law, but all that's articulated is law. And I think that Philip's poem Zong does that quite nicely, actually, for me. I don't know how much for David, but I think for me it does that quite nicely. It's one of the best examples that I can think of that, which maybe comes back to the silence we were talking about earlier. Does it, and then the final thing, does thinking in terms of ontology require a modernist mode of thought in the first place? I mean, that's a huge question. Coming back to the previous thing, I think for me, it's still within a modernist ontology, what I'm trying to think through with abyssal thought. So that is where it's at. Historically, I don't know how I would go further back, but David may think otherwise.
I think ontology is inherently modern because it asserts a reality that we can be suborned to, which is not like mythical or cosmological. So that the suborning of us to that reality is a voluntary one in modernity. It's not just because of coercion or anything else. So that reality has to do a lot of work in substantiating subject and modes of its governance. So my view is that ontology is necessarily modern, and in being so, is necessarily violent. But violence is not like you think there's good about violence, bad violence. The point is that it's not natural, that it has no sort of magical birth. You know, it wasn't just dropped out of like some alien spacecraft. It was forged through its own justifications. That's the point about it. It's not just that it's violent because its maintenance is an ongoing violence. The point is that it's forging itself. Its year zero is never the year zero. That's why it's a process of desedimentation and not deconstruction, because you're not deconstructing law and non-law, you're desedimenting the story of origin. And in doing that, you're doing much more than deconstruction, sort of thing.
And I think that was why it was probably almost inevitable that we would be looking figuratively to the Caribbean. You know, it's just such a place to think through the forging of ontology, through that violence, through the Middle Passage, and so on. So I think that's why in the book, obviously we're interested in different developments in critical thought, but I think, you know, the Caribbean becomes that place, perhaps in a way that in our previous book, the island and islandness becomes that place to think through kind of relational ontologies and so on. Great, thanks, makes sense to me, good.
There was some discussion at the beginning about break, and also of some conversation between David and Jonathan. So I wanted to bring up the possibility of taking maybe 5 minutes and then coming back, and maybe you two might ask each other some questions, if that's interesting to you.
We can give it a go. I wasn't sure if we'd already been doing some of that, but yeah, let's do that. Maybe 7 minutes. Okay.
Yeah,
Let's
long
go,
enough.
let's run. I'm gonna take me a while to get out of the building. Anyway, good. Okay.
And if
See you
anyone
in
else
a-
has questions as well, please feel, if you think of a question, chip in.
So yeah, if anyone has any questions, they can ask them, or you can ask questions amongst yourselves if you have any, or if anything came up in the course of the discussion so far.
I'm interested in asking any audience members if they read the book, what they thought about it, actually. Bearing in mind that it's work in progress and we're open to upfront discussion.
Maybe people have already asked their questions they wanted on it.
I mean, do people think it's a useful project to be problematizing the relational and the non-relational from a position that's even less modern, rather than a more traditional approach of the political and modernity? Maybe you feel that we're like giving too much up.
I don't.
Go ahead,
No, you could definitely.
Jared, if you may.
Yeah, you should carry on.
I was wondering a little bit about the distinction between critical positionality and literal positionality, because literal positionality does seem to be applicable in anti-racist organization through something like hiring or admission quotas. So I mean, I guess I wanted to ask what are the applications of the critical positionality, and that's just a question that came up in this discussion of relational, non-relational, abyssal.
Yeah. So I think we wanted to distinguish it from a literal positionality, because of the way in which the modern subject just continues to world itself in new ways. I don't think we're quite so taken by the sorts of developments and debates. Well, I'll speak for myself. I'm not quite so taken by those sorts of developments and debates on a literal level. Whilst, of course, we all live in the literal world, and we have our own ways of surviving and developing and doing things. I think from the perspective that kind of wish to pursue, it can't take place in a literal way. Well, we're already literally within modernity. So the task, I think, for us to try and push forward is to continue to develop a mode of critique that actually doesn't move on from a modern way of thinking, but actually seeks to desediment it from within. So I think we've talked about power ontology. I mean, one thing that's quite interesting, I was talking more recently as well about Lacan Noir and things like that. It's what kind of resources are around that are trying to think maybe roughly in that zone. And all too easily, they don't. And I think in many ways, thinking back on the book, because David was asking what do people think about it, it can actually be seen as a struggle to also try and do that in itself. You know, I like to groundwork through examples. Yeah, that's what geographers do. But as soon as you do that, you're coming back within the world of modernity, or the literal world, as you were saying. So I think conceptually it's really tricky to try and develop frameworks that allow you to do that mode of critique, that figurative mode of critique that we're talking about. David?
Yes, I think I disagree, because the world literally all the time tells us about the limits of doing politics and the limits of doing relational and non-relational work. I mean, if you think about international relations, people are still doing development work, peace building work, even though they say we're not saying that we want to build peace. We realize that we need to do unsettling peace, because every peace agreement is just going to reconstitute insiders and outsiders and be problematic. We know that settlements lead to new conflicts, so therefore we want to do peace as unsettlement. We need to, instead of teaching people about peace, we need to teach people about how we always need instability, and we always need to be working and opening ourselves up to things, but never actually having closure. The problem with modernity was always the fantasy of closure. So to my mind, that's the whole purpose of a meta-theoretical, meta-political framework, is that the objects of critique are unfortunately all too much all around us all the time, every day. The difference is that you're not like suborn to say, this is my alternative, you know. As soon as you're in that position of reconstituting like a governing, imaginary, problem-solving, salvaging things in the world, then that's problematic. That's the importance of the figurative positionality rather than a literal positionality. If we're not saying that people shouldn't do politics, but to me, it's like it's no different to sort of religion or something. People want to do religion for different reasons. They're like, you know, build communities, do good things or bad things. That's all fine. To me, it's a personal thing. It's not, you know, we're not sort of saying, oh no, you have to do this. We're just, this is on an academic sort of philosophical, a meta-political thing. We're just trying to carve a bit of space to do this other thing. That's, I sort of think how I imagine it. The meta-politics is actually more political than doing politics.
So what would be your stance on creativity, or even like the impulse of imagination? Let's say, even if you draw into like a biological setup, would you expand on stimuli? Yes. Let's say I have a beautiful bright thought of creation today in an abyssal setup paradigm. Do I break it apart in the instance, and do I defy it? What should I do?
I think for me, there's you know, David and I obviously talk all the time, and I think there's a huge amount of actually what I would think of as creativity in trying to think through this figurative position. You know, I don't think you can obviously think creativity as something that's literal in the world, but I think what we're trying to do is trying to create or think through what a figurative position would be, and that's extremely difficult. You know, I mean, the book makes an attempt, and I think more recently we're getting further on in some of our, you know, the more recent stuff we've been just drafting and things. But I think that's for me, that's an extremely creative process, to try and think through the details of what that figurative position would be, conceptually, you know, thinking with power ontology, thinking with all these things. So I feel that's creative, perhaps in a different way.
I sort of think it's just therapeutic. It's no different to me than being religious. You know, whatever gets you going, keeps you going, that's all good. And but it's a bit like Adorno, you know, can we do poetry after Auschwitz or something? Yeah, I'm sure Antoine can do an amazing, beautiful, creative thing. But really, you know, when we're just looking at genocide on our screens on the news or something. Yeah, I mean, there's no problem with doing that. In fact, it's probably necessary. So I think there's a different, we're not, as I sort of tried to say before, we're not against people sort of surviving in doing politics and art, religion, whatever it takes. We're just carving out what metapolitics might look like. Oh,
Okay. I was just waiting for everyone to signpost their agreement. No, so I've been listening to everything that you've been saying while I've been trying to cook, but I'm still like somewhat struggling, honestly, to understand precisely what it is that you're doing, because I'm just gonna read from the very end of the book a small section, and then I will kind of try to explain what my concern is. So you write on the very last page: if we understand relational, post-human, and new materialist approaches as coming to prominence in the wake of disillusionment with a modernist and rationalist political ontology, then we could describe the abyssal as seeking to move otherwise, and to problematize this relational or ontological turn, providing a different register of understanding. So it seems to me that what you call the relational, post-human, and new materialist approaches, what they have in common is that they are approaches, they're operating literally in a way. They're attempting to speak to the world and describe the world. As far as I've been gathering, you say that the abyssal approach, or abyssal analytic, is slightly different in that it kind of attaches into how these approaches operate in order to kind of desediment them. You might correct me if I'm wrong, but then you're also doing a third thing. So it's like which is articulating how the abyssal kind of analytic operates on these critiques. But in a way, then you're describing how the abyssal analytic operates literally on these kind of approaches that take the world as their literal object through figurative means. So it all becomes very, very complicated what you're actually doing. But I guess I wonder, you know, to what extent do you think that almost this kind of, for me, the difficulty is sort of you have to make some kind of claim about how these, how new materialism and posthumanism, for instance, what their kind of efficacy on the world is, even to kind of outline the abyssal analytic as kind of a, not even an alternative, but kind of, you know, almost what's the point, right? So it becomes, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but I'm just trying to kind of push you a little bit to, you know, what are you actually doing, if that makes sense.
So I'll just come back to that very briefly, because I talked to Carl more. I think that what you're basically saying is we didn't really set up the critique of the relational term. We went a bit more straight into the abyssal framework, which is quite complicated, and therefore, as a result, you know, where's the critical purchase? I actually think that's probably quite a fair point, and we've actually rolled back a bit in a couple of things we're just kind of doing at the moment that kind of slow down, and as a result, I think it's a fair point you make, because we go straight into more the abyss analytic, and I think perhaps it's fair to say there's a bit of an assumption that the relational and ontological stuff and the post-humanism stuff is problematic and what it does. So I would just take that as a fair point, actually, there, Carl. And then actually I'm going to let David respond on the kind of different levels that you were talking about.
So that's what a meta critique is. It takes literally critique. So we are taking literally claims that people make about decolonizing, post-human, blah, going beyond this, whatever they're doing. And we're sort of saying, okay, you know, you say that you're doing this, however, it seems that you're not actually doing what you think you're doing. And that's the sort of abyssal project. The abyssal project is not saying you should be doing that, or reality says something otherwise. It's purely you say that you're not being colonial, but hey, you're still there. You're still doing stuff, and you're still like having a relationship of hierarchy over other people. You say you don't have an ontology or whatever, but nevertheless, your non-ontology is just doing the work of ontology. That's sort of the point. Whatever they say that they're doing, my hunch is that they're probably not doing it. And I'm open to the idea that me and John aren't doing what we're doing, but what we say we're doing or not achieving it or not being consistent. I see that all the time in my own work. But at least I sort of understand what I'm claiming to be doing, that I'm not making assumptions about some world. I'm not making some assumptions about some subject, that it's already difficult enough to think through and understand the mechanisms, the how of how we can be governed without ontology, how we can be governed through the decentering of the subject, how we can be reproducing anti-blackness by saying that we're being anti-racist. And how we've been doing that for hundreds of years. These are the sort of things that I'm interested in doing, not because I want to make the world better, because I want to engage in the academy with other critical theorists and sort of say, yes, but there's this other space, this other way of thinking, or maybe other ways of thinking that are being included, being silenced through this sort of homogenous turning of like relation, non-relation, ontological turn. These things are like being parroted and reproduced, and everyone's sort of going, yeah. And like we're just sort of saying, hold on a minute, that's all. So that's why the abyssal is like it's figurative. It's like imagining what if there was something beyond relation and non-relation, beyond ontology and non-ontology, beyond relation and non-relation, and critique and affirmation, these sorts of things. Whatever they say is the choice, we have to say no, I personally think.
Yeah, that's quite clarifying. I have a kind of a retort, but if anyone else wants to join the conversation, I think I was just okay. Fine. So I think I agree with you, and I think by and large, many of these kind of if we might call them purportedly postmodern approaches, be it posthumanism or new materialism as they are understood in, for instance, in geography, they are not necessarily doing what they are claiming to do. The problem is that in claiming that they are not doing what they say they're doing, we have to kind of make a claim. We are in this claim. This claim is itself a literal claim. This is not a figurative claim, right? And in making this claim about that they're actually not faithful to what they're saying that they're doing, we have to somehow get back into we're kind of have a one-way ticket back into the world, and we have to make a claim about the world again. At this point, when we kind of make this claim, we're no longer simply talking figuratively, but we have to kind of draw on some kind of, and then we enter into the same, then we end up with kind of needing to approximate the world and how it is again. So this is where I see that this could potentially run into some issues.
So it's a bit like the critique of the post-structuralists or the postmodernists. How can you have a position of critique or or deconstruction without having a ground or whatever? So I take your point, Carl, but thing is that if the claim is really based on what people are saying and writing, then I think that's fine. If the claim is that like we're intervening in this other country, but not colonially, but like decolonially intervening, the point is that, well, it looks the same, it feels the same. To my mind, that's not a literal statement about the world. It's not a literal statement about how you can do development or how you can do peace. It's not a literal statement about ontology, that really underneath these things there's this sort of relationality or something. But I take your point that we are still doing academic work, we are still subjects in academia, etc. But so yeah, but I personally see no contradiction at all.
No, I mean, I think one way, perhaps it's also, for me, it's a process of clarification. So it's kind of what tools can you bring to you know, these various shifts that are taking place that are actually just extending the limits of thinkability of the modern subject to clarify that process. Yeah. So from David can speak for himself, but from my perspective, I quite like this idea of it just extending the limits of thinkability. So if you're just, for me, it's about clarifying how that process is going on. Yeah. So if we talk about the non-relational and so on, so you could take something like the undercommons, for example, as a really nice way of kind of clarifying how logistics plays out. Now, if you just use it as a clarificatory technique, the stakes slightly shift. Yeah. But I think it's beholden on David and I to develop the meta-political tools that enable us to draw out that clarification. And, you know, one of the things we're thinking through is, at the moment, you know, how do you engage with readings of maybe Fanon to do that, or how you engage with power ontology, or how you engage with various tools, but with the purpose of clarifying it. Sometimes you can just give a talk at a conference that just literally just restates what someone said. Yeah, and it's a mode of clarification of the extension of the limitability, an expansion of the modern subject, which is, and you just lay it out, and that's where it is, as it were. But I think the abyssal approach is a bit more than that, in that we're trying to develop the tools and techniques, and you know, that enable us to do that process. I think Antoine's
just to be clear, I didn't want to say, go for a kind of a hard critique of what you're doing, but what I had was a question. It was a question about the relative position of the abyssal analytic in relation to these other approaches, right? So
just to be absolutely clear, David and I welcome hard critiques because it's precisely what enables us to develop. So if anyone has any, please make them. But thanks, Kyle, anyway.
The way I understand it, practicability in a practicability right now is it's you're not trying to construct anything that's like a dogma. It feels for me that it's between the effective and the affective, as such as it's like a meditation. I feel it is something that when you meditate on the absolute negativity of any intent with the abyssal framework, let's say political or I don't know, medical in a system of healing, I will use that concept as like a black mirror, nothing to do with the fiction, as something that it's a behavior of entertaining, cultivating pure negativity to react in a cybernetic manner, or that's something that you still can judge and interact with your own judgment and advance. And I find it this is how I understand it right now, and I will apply it. It makes me think about wabi-sabi in Japan. It makes me think like a pure poetical object before the poetics as named it. It makes me feel like a raw imagination, but maybe in a more philosophical, articulated manner. In this way.
Thank you, Antoine. That sounds really nice and positive. I'm not sure that that's my understanding of our project, though. But
No,
I'm happy for you to sort of. But I don't really see it as like a free floating tool like that. I sort of see it as a critique of critique, as like a particularly historically, socially situated critique of contemporary understandings, which are generally the sort of post-human, the relational, and the non-relational. And it's an attempt to sort of bring them into the world and say, this is how they work. These are the devastating consequences that they have when we're governed like this. Therefore, these are problematic. That's how I see the underlying project. I think that The World as Abyss as a book doesn't draw that out properly because maybe it's a work of geography, and it's like looking at how the Caribbean is drawn on in the ontological turn in critical Black studies. And so I'm not sure if it's a fault or not, but I don't. So it's possible that it doesn't come through like that, and it sort of comes through as a sort of, this is an interesting sort of similar to deconstruction, but with a sort of deep sort of race and colonial content. So yeah, I mean, I'm happy for people to use or think things as they will do. But for me, this is sort of efflorescence of something else. But that's the way that academic work goes, doesn't it? You know, you're in communities, you work through ideas, and you know, you move on, as Foucault says, like a sort of crab sideways. But for me, it's like, how can we do critique in today's context where critique has been so associated with some patronizing elitist sort of knowing better about stuff than other people, and like those days are over. But equally, you don't want to do post critique. You don't want to just like do empirical, let's trace these things and say something interesting. How do you sort of work in that sort of space that isn't necessarily a space? I'm not sure.
If I can retort, in my little world that is way less articulated than yours, I've begun a metacritique layout of art, and so where I'm from, the administrative public system is really ingrained within art, so you have to game up your art to just be allowed. And so the critique or the metacritique is that what are the paradigmatic advancement artworks are already trained to train back other generation of artists to be more and more submissive, and so that you cannot actually have ejection speed, ejection velocity of your own paradigm, and so it just crumbles up to sands. And so that's my little thing in art. But if I just game and apply it to your own system, it would be that it is important to put this reflection in each knowledge producing agent or unit, so it can act not as a portal, let's say, like physically, but as a derangement, like a permanent derangement within each constitutive knowledge, so it stays dynamically active.
Just going to come back, we've had this other question here about just to paraphrase the last bit, it's difficult to swallow because it means we have to take seriously the fact that we are stuck, that there is no way out of the nightmare of this world. Oh, just another one. Just to take that first point, I don't know how David sees it, but I actually think that academia can play a really important job in these debates and discussions. I don't know if it's about you're stuck or not stuck or whatever. You know, people go about and do their things in their everyday lives. But I think that what perhaps this comes from is just trying to take what we mean by critique differently. I think we're just deeply dissatisfied with the ongoing expansion of the modern subject through all these different turns that have taken place. And I think that what academia can do, or what we can do, is just try and slow down. It's nice that people get paid to do this stuff, to slow down and just to think through, not so much that you're stuck and this is it, yeah, but why would it be that we are stuck and this is it within contemporary frameworks of reasoning, and just to slow down and kind of think that one through. Don't know if David wants to add. We've got another question as well.
Also, Carolyn, if you would like to elaborate the question, please do. I mean, I sort of assume that when the questions or comments come in chat, that's the preference. And I can also read it out loud. But if you would like to speak, you may. And if not, I'd like to just read the comment out loud so that it's on record. In my understanding, are you not also saying that it is futile to try and find any kind of solution to the overwhelming violence and destruction that are even pre-ontologically inherent inside this world. And is this maybe what is difficult to swallow, because it means we have to take seriously the fact that we are stuck, that there is no way out of the nightmare of this world. And then I can also read this next one from Daniel. The late ontology of Lukács is considered by many as an apology of Stalinist realism. I wonder which of your critiques of the ontological approach can find parallels in the dismissal of that particular ontology by Agnes Heller and others? Just a thought for which I have not an answer yet.
Question. Unfortunately, it's so long since I thought of Lukács and Agnes Heller that I'm not able to answer that question. I'm just so stuck in like contemporary things. But that's it, Daniel. That's a good. I'd be interested in maybe community. You can always email to continue the discussion, Daniel or anyone else, of course. In terms of Caroline's question, one thing I do not like or is problematic is the recognition of the disastrous and the violentness of the world just becomes another way of, being a post-human subject, putting the past behind us because we recognize it, then we move on to something else. So I don't think that that's our point, because that's a little bit too much like an ontological point about the history of the world and understanding that history and how we're sort of steeped and limited by it. That's to me not the focus that I want to focus on. And often when we're doing this sort of ontological work, it's always about the creation, the constitution of the ontology through violence, through the Middle Passage or 1492 or something like that. I would just rather focus on, for myself, as a sort of theorist of governance, on how sort of relational and non-relational ways of thinking are used today to govern us, how they're the way out of the crisis of modernity. But the lines of these things were already drawn with Hegel, with Kant. These were already recognized in the constructions of the modernist subject and the world, and the continual need for remaking and transformation. I mean, anti-racism, anti-being sort of, as we understand, being stuck in the world of prejudice and closure, the war against that has always been part of the Enlightenment and the modernist project. So being against the terribleness of the world is to my mind neither here nor there. I think the key point is that contemporary understandings think that we've moved beyond modernity or moved beyond the subject, but actually they're just working within it. So maybe I see my work as just a sort of footnote on Sylvia Wynter's already brilliant work on how the modernist subject can be sort of reshaped, and how the color line, how the barrier between the political and non-political, being and non-being, is entirely malleable, how anti-blackness is at the center of those things. I'm particularly concerned with how to draw that out in terms of contemporary thinking.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, the work that we're kind of on now, we've in our previous work we've turned to islandness and the Caribbean and things like that, because we feel that they were perhaps particularly strong places where these kind of debates were being drawn out and developed. But I acknowledge the kind of almost danger that David's pointing to there. I think it's, these, one thing I was trying to emphasize in the short talk was, how these kind of questions of debates about non-relation and relation and so on are just more generally prevalent. And I think that's where we're kind of focusing on now and trying to think through those more contemporary debates as they play out in all sorts of arenas and places.
I'm imagining that we're going to get some any concluding comments or questions. What do you think, Maure?
Sure. I was going to offer Daniel a chance to speak a little bit on how Lukács might fit in his view, but we could also
Well,
have any concluding comments?
for instance,
Please.
the most clear object of critique is the stratified organization is in the hierarchy. What interests me is that these approaches have 50 years fragments, it is 70 years old. So I don't have much to add. All these critiques are applicable, are applicable to both Herman and Lukács ontology. But what interests me about them is that they are just 50 and 50 years old. So to me, it's more the question of intellectual history or tracing the question of ontology from 70 years ago to now. So all these critics are still applicable, but I don't really have a larger point. I should investigate more about the early critiques of Lukács ontology, just to find how many of them are still relevant today.
Thank you. Okay, would anyone like to bring up any other questions or comments? And if no one has anything to bring, Dr. Chandler and Dr. Pugh, what kind of final comments or questions would you like to raise?
Go on, Jonathan, you can sum up for both of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, the first thing, anyone who wants to, get in touch and follow up, then, please do. And thank you so much for Foreign Object for hosting us. We've really enjoyed it very much indeed. It's been a great discussion. We're I think it's important to say again, we're just thinking this through. This is we obviously hope you engage with the world as abyss as you do Anthropocene Islands, but we're just trying to think through what this kind of maybe metapolitical mode of critique. I don't think we even use that word in the book, but that's a phrase we're trying to think through, this kind of figurative position that engages the relational term, the non-relational, and so on, and the expansion of the modern subject. So I don't really have a great big finale conclusion or anything other than just to say, we thank you very much for engaging our work, and we've really enjoyed it.
Thanks, guys.
Yes, thank you very much. It was wonderful.
I was trying to find the little clappy hands thing, emoji, but yeah,
It's
thank
there
you.
somewhere.
No worries. Anyway, thanks a lot. Thanks for all the wonderful questions and contributions. It's made me think a lot. That's the best thing about doing these things. You don't really know what you think until people ask you questions.